The morning of reckoning. The clock displayed 8:42 a.m. as Cameron Price steered his vehicle into the municipal courthouse parking lot in Fairhope, Alabama. The sun was already warm, casting sharp golden beams across the asphalt, and Cameron adjusted his tie in the rearview mirror, trying to calm the agitation in his chest. The day had already started on a bad note. A missed alarm, unexpected road construction, and a phone call about an urgent federal case had left him running dangerously late. Cameron was an assistant United States attorney, seasoned in the rigors of high-stakes prosecutions. But today wasn't about federal crimes or courtroom showdowns. It was personal. The issue at hand was a glaring error in the property tax on his mother's home. The house where she'd raised him and his two younger sisters after their father passed away. The city's unexplained tax hike threatened to destabilize their family's finances, and Cameron was determined to fight it. The house wasn't just a structure. It was the heart of his family's legacy, a place filled with memories of resilience and love. Dressed in a sharp gray suit with a crisp white shirt and a subtle blue tie, Cameron looked every bit the composed attorney he was, even if his morning had been anything but smooth. He grabbed his briefcase, containing meticulously prepared documents, and stepped out into the sun. As he hurried up the courthouse steps, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He quickly glanced at the message from a colleague. "Heads up, Judge Harold Barnes doesn't take kindly to tardiness. Be careful." Cameron's jaw tightened slightly. He had heard of Judge Barnes, a man reputed for his stern demeanor and rigid adherence to courtroom protocol. Shrugging off the warning, Cameron entered the courthouse, determined to rely on the unshakable foundation of evidence he carried. Facts were his ally, and he was ready to wield them. The municipal courthouse was a stark contrast to the federal halls of justice Cameron was used to. The walls were an uninspiring beige, the benches scuffed and creaky, and the air carried the faint aroma of stale coffee. People crowded the hallway, clutching documents, their faces etched with anxiety over parking fines, landlord disputes, and minor infractions. Cameron checked his watch. 8:52 a.m. He was cutting it close. Following the signage, he navigated the narrow hallway until he reached courtroom 3B. The brass nameplate on the door read, "Judge Harold Barnes." Stepping inside, Cameron found the room already filled with people. A palpable tension hung in the air. Lawyers whispered to clients, and clerks shuffled papers at their desks. Cameron slid into his seat near the back, opened his briefcase, and began reviewing his evidence. A sudden hush fell over the room as the door behind the bench swung open. Judge Barnes entered, his tall frame accentuated by his dark robe, his white hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His piercing gaze swept across the room, silencing any remaining murmurs. "All rise," the bailiff called. Cameron stood with the others, observing the judge's commanding presence. Barnes' reputation as a no-nonsense enforcer of courtroom decorum was immediately evident. He seated himself with a practiced air of authority, scanning the docket before him. Case after case was called with mechanical efficiency. Judge Barnes wasted no time, issuing judgments and fines with a crisp, detached tone. Cameron couldn't help but notice a troubling pattern. A middle-aged man in a business suit arrived late, slipping into the courtroom unnoticed. A young woman in casual attire entered moments later, her tardiness met with indifference. Cameron glanced at his watch again. 9:14 a.m. Just as he adjusted his tie, he heard his name called. Cameron Price. Taking a steadying breath, Cameron stood, his calm demeanor masking his inner frustration. He approached the podium with deliberate composure, holding his folder tightly. "Mr. Price, you're late," Judge Barnes declared, his voice sharp and unforgiving. "Your Honor," Cameron began, his tone respectful but firm, "I apologize for the delay. I was addressing an urgent matter regarding a federal investigation." Judge Barnes cut him off. "Excuses do not excuse tardiness. This courtroom operates on discipline and respect. You are hereby fined $500 for contempt of court." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Cameron's brow furrowed slightly. But he quickly composed himself. Around him, murmurs of unease spread among the spectators. "Your Honor," Cameron tried again, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding. My tardiness was not due to negligence but—" The judge slammed his gavel. "Enough. This is not a debate. Consider it a lesson in punctuality." Cameron stepped back, his jaw tightening. He glanced briefly at the others who had arrived late but faced no consequences. The disparity was glaring, and a fire ignited within him. He returned to his seat, opening his folder as though to review his notes. But this time, he wasn't focusing on property tax records. He began jotting down observations, his pen moving swiftly across the page. As the morning wore on, Cameron watched Judge Barnes with a critical eye. The pattern became undeniable. Defendants who shared Cameron's skin color seemed to face harsher penalties and more scrutiny than their white counterparts. A young black woman was fined heavily for a minor traffic violation, while a white man with multiple infractions was let off with a warning. Cameron's legal mind processed the situation with precision. This wasn't just about his own treatment. It was about systemic bias cloaked in the guise of authority. He knew he couldn't let this moment pass unchallenged. When the judge called for a recess, Cameron lingered, observing the room as others filed out. An older black man approached him, his expression a mix of frustration and quiet solidarity. "Been dealing with this for years," the man muttered. "Good to see someone who might actually stand up to him." Cameron nodded, his resolve hardening. As he left the courtroom, he felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This was no longer just about a property tax adjustment. It was about exposing and confronting a deeper injustice that had persisted unchecked for far too long. Back in his car, Cameron opened his laptop and began drafting a detailed report, documenting every observation, every instance of disparity he had witnessed. He knew this was only the beginning. A single courtroom encounter had transformed into a call to action, a fight not just for himself, but for countless others who had been silenced or dismissed. By the time he finished, Cameron wasn't just preparing to challenge a tax error. He was preparing to challenge a system that had long ignored the principles of fairness and equality it claimed to uphold. Unraveling the layers. The courthouse parking lot was nearly empty by the time Cameron stepped into the warm midday sun. Despite the tension simmering beneath his calm exterior, he couldn't afford to rush. He took measured steps toward his car, his mind already running through the implications of the morning's events. This wasn't just about the fine or the judge's hostility. It was about the larger pattern of behavior he'd observed. His instincts, honed over years as a federal prosecutor, told him this wasn't an isolated incident. Sliding into the driver's seat, Cameron pulled out his phone and quickly tapped a message to his legal assistant, Carla. "Need you to pull municipal court records for Judge Harold Barnes, specifically interested in sentencing trends, fines, and racial demographics over the last 5 years." He hit send and leaned back, exhaling deeply. He knew Carla would work fast. She was one of the sharpest assistants he'd ever worked with. She had an eye for patterns, and if there was something systemic behind Judge Barnes' behavior, she'd find it. That afternoon, Cameron sat in his small home office, the comforting clutter of legal books and family photos surrounding him. His laptop screen was filled with spreadsheets and scanned court documents. Carla had outdone herself. She'd managed to pull years of data from public court records, and the patterns were starting to emerge. The disparities were undeniable. For minor infractions such as traffic violations, black defendants were fined, on average, 40% more than their white counterparts. Cases involving white defendants were more likely to be dismissed outright, while black defendants faced harsher penalties even for similar offenses. The data painted a damning picture of judicial bias. As Cameron scrolled through the files, his phone buzzed. It was Carla. "Cameron," she said, her voice low but steady. "I started digging deeper into Barnes' past. Did you know he was censured by the state bar 15 years ago?" Cameron sat up straighter. "No. What for?" "Back then, he was a private attorney. He was accused of discriminatory practices in his firm's hiring policies. The bar sanctioned him, but he appealed, and the punishment was reduced to a reprimand. It didn't stop him from becoming a judge a few years later. Cameron pinched the bridge of his nose, processing the information. "Good work, Carla. Keep digging. I need everything. Courtroom transcripts, public complaints, anything that points to a pattern." "I'm on it," she said before hanging up. Cameron leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Judge Barnes had slipped through the cracks once, but this time, Cameron wouldn't let him escape accountability. The following morning, Cameron arrived at his office early, armed with fresh resolve. He called a meeting with Julia Harper, his supervisor and a trusted mentor. Julia was a no-nonsense attorney with decades of experience in federal prosecutions, and Cameron knew she would understand the gravity of the situation. Julia entered the conference room, her expression curious but composed. "What's going on, Cameron? Carla mentioned you've been digging into a municipal court judge." Cameron gestured toward a stack of documents on the table. "Julia, I believe Judge Harold Barnes is engaging in systemic judicial bias. The data I've gathered shows significant racial disparities in his rulings, and yesterday I experienced his behavior firsthand." He walked her through the morning's events, the fine, and the stark contrast in how Barnes treated other latecomers. Then he presented the statistical evidence Carla had compiled. Julia's expression darkened as she scanned the documents. "This is bad," she muttered. "If even half of this is accurate, Barnes isn't just biased. He's a liability to the judiciary." Cameron nodded. "I want to take this further. I think we need to escalate this to the Judicial Review Commission. They need to investigate him." Julia leaned back in her chair, her gaze piercing. "You know what you're proposing, right? Going after a sitting judge, even at the municipal level, is going to ruffle feathers. You'll make enemies." "I've dealt with worse," Cameron replied firmly. "This isn't just about me. It's about the hundreds, maybe thousands, of people he's penalized unfairly over the years. If we don't hold him accountable, who will?" Julia considered this for a moment before nodding. "All right, but we need to do this by the book. I'll reach out to the review commission and start laying the groundwork. In the meantime, keep gathering evidence. And Cameron, yes, watch your back. Judges like Barnes don't go down quietly." Cameron spent the next week immersed in research. He interviewed defense attorneys who had regularly appeared before Barnes, many of whom were reluctant to speak on the record. Still, their off-the-record comments were telling. Stories of disproportionately high fines, dismissive attitudes toward black defendants, and even subtle intimidation tactics against attorneys who challenged him. One young attorney, Megan Ellis, finally agreed to speak openly. "I've been practicing law for 5 years," she said during a meeting in Cameron's office. "In that time, I've handled over 20 cases in Barnes' courtroom. It's always the same. If my client is black, he's harsher. If my client is white, he's lenient. I've filed motions challenging his decisions, but they never go anywhere." Megan handed Cameron a folder filled with transcripts from her cases. "I'm tired of staying quiet. If you're building a case against him, I'll help." Cameron took the folder, feeling the surge of gratitude. "Thank you, Megan. Your courage will make a difference." By the end of the second week, the evidence against Judge Barnes was mounting. Cameron had compiled a detailed report outlining the racial disparities in Barnes' rulings, supported by statistical data, courtroom transcripts, and first-hand accounts. Julia reviewed the report, her expression grim. "This is solid," she said. "The review commission will have a hard time ignoring this." The next step was filing a formal complaint. Cameron drafted a letter to the Judicial Review Commission, outlining his findings and requesting a comprehensive investigation into Barnes' conduct. As he signed the document, he felt a mix of determination and apprehension. He knew this would be a fight, but it was one worth taking on. The complaint sent ripples through the legal community. Within days, the Review Commission announced a preliminary inquiry into Judge Barnes. Investigators requested access to his case records and began interviewing court staff and attorneys who had worked in his courtroom. The media caught wind of the story, and local newspapers ran headlines like, "Municipal Judge Accused of Bias. Federal Prosecutor Speaks Out." Cameron tried to keep a low profile, but the attention was unavoidable. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, hoping for a comment. Community leaders reached out, expressing support and sharing their own grievances about Barnes Court. Cameron even received an anonymous letter from a former clerk detailing more instances of Barnes' discriminatory behavior. Through it all, Cameron remained focused. He knew the road ahead would be long and challenging, but he also knew he wasn't alone. The fight for justice had begun, and Cameron was prepared to see it through to the end. The investigation unfolds. The hum of activity in Cameron's office was palpable as he sifted through another stack of affidavits and court records. The preliminary investigation into Judge Barnes was gaining momentum, and Cameron's role as a key witness and evidence gatherer had thrust him into a whirlwind of legal strategy and community outreach. Emails from local attorneys, activists, and even former court clerks poured in daily. Each one added another piece to the puzzle: inconsistent rulings, disparate fines, and a troubling pattern of disdain toward certain defendants. Cameron read through one particularly damning affidavit from a court clerk who had worked with Barnes for over a decade. Judge Barnes would often comment privately about defendants, using phrases like, "He looks like trouble," or, "Of course, they're here again." These remarks were almost always directed at black defendants, even before cases were presented. I knew it was wrong, but I was scared to speak out. Cameron's jaw tightened as he read the words. The systemic nature of Barnes' behavior was becoming clearer, but proving it in a formal setting would require airtight evidence and relentless advocacy. Meanwhile, the Judicial Review Commission's inquiry was escalating. Investigators were combing through years of Barnes' rulings, his financial disclosures, and even his courtroom surveillance footage. Cameron had heard whispers that they'd uncovered troubling anomalies in the judge's financial records, possible kickbacks from private probation companies that disproportionately targeted marginalized communities. As the investigation deepened, Cameron began to receive calls from unexpected allies. Civil rights organizations, local law professors, and even retired judges reached out, offering resources and strategic advice. One such call came from Judge Patricia Warren, a retired federal judge with a reputation for championing justice. "I've been following the developments in your case, Cameron," she said, her voice steady but impassioned. "What you're doing takes courage, but you need to be prepared for the backlash. Judges like Barnes often have allies in high places." "I appreciate the warning," Cameron replied, "but I'm not backing down. This is bigger than me." Judge Warren chuckled lightly. "Good. Just make sure your case is bulletproof. These types of battles are rarely won on emotion alone." A community's awakening. As news of the investigation spread, the community began to rally. Town halls were organized, with citizens sharing their stories of unfair treatment in Barnes' courtroom. Cameron attended one such meeting, held in the basement of a local church. The room was packed with people of all ages and backgrounds, their faces a mixture of anger, pain, and determination. An elderly woman stood to speak, her voice trembling but resolute. "I've lived in this town my whole life. My grandson was fined $1,500 for a parking violation because he couldn't pay it all up front. They put him on probation, and the fees nearly ruined us. But I've seen others walk out of that courtroom with just a warning. It's not right." A young man in a hoodie spoke next, his tone raw with frustration. "Judge Barnes didn't even let me explain myself. He looked at me like I was guilty the moment I walked in. I was there for a noise complaint, but he treated me like a criminal." Cameron listened intently, taking notes and offering words of encouragement. He could see the ripple effect his actions were having. The people were finding their voices, and for many, this was the first time they felt heard. Barnes pushes back. As the walls began to close in around Judge Barnes, he didn't remain silent. Through his attorney, Barnes issued a public statement denying all allegations of bias and misconduct. "These accusations are baseless and politically motivated." The statement read, "I have always upheld the principles of fairness and justice in my courtroom." Privately, however, Barnes was feeling the pressure. Leaked reports indicated he had been calling in favors with influential colleagues, hoping to stall or discredit the investigation. Cameron wasn't surprised when he started receiving anonymous threats. Late one night, as he reviewed case files in his office, his phone buzzed with a blocked number. "You're playing a dangerous game, Price," a distorted voice warned. "You don't know who you're messing with." Cameron hung up without responding, his resolve only hardening. He immediately reported the call to the U.S. Attorney's Office and increased security measures at his home. The Commission's preliminary findings. 2 months into the investigation, the Judicial Review Commission held a press conference to share its preliminary findings. Cameron watched the live broadcast in his office, flanked by Carla and Julia. A spokesperson for the commission stood at the podium, flanked by investigators. "Our preliminary investigation has uncovered significant evidence of racial bias and irregularities in Judge Harold Barnes' rulings. We have also identified potential financial misconduct related to probation services contracted by the court. These findings warrant a full judicial review, and Judge Barnes has been temporarily suspended pending further investigation." The room erupted in applause as the spokesperson stepped away from the podium. Carla turned to Cameron, her eyes wide with excitement. "You did it, Cam. This is huge." Cameron shook his head, his expression sober. "This is just the beginning. Barnes might be suspended, but he hasn't been removed yet. We need to keep pushing." The next chapter. As Cameron walked out of his office that evening, the crisp autumn air felt lighter than it had in weeks. He knew the battle was far from over, but the tide was turning. The investigation into Judge Barnes had sparked a larger conversation about systemic injustice in the legal system, and Cameron was determined to see it through to the end. In the weeks that followed, Cameron continued to gather evidence and prepare for the formal hearings against Barnes. He knew the judge's allies would fight tooth and nail to protect him, but Cameron also knew he had the truth and the community on his side. The fight for justice wasn't over, but Cameron was ready. This was no longer just about Judge Barnes. It was about ensuring that no one else would have to face the kind of discrimination that had plagued his courtroom for years. And for Cameron, that fight was worth everything. Facing the opposition. The days following Judge Barnes' suspension were both a relief and a prelude to a storm. Cameron knew the judicial system rarely changed without a fight, and Barnes' allies were gearing up to push back against the accusations. What Cameron didn't anticipate was how personal the attacks would become. It started with whispers in the courthouse. Other judges, attorneys, and even clerks began avoiding Cameron in the hallways, their gazes cautious, their greetings subdued. Cameron had been prepared for professional isolation, but when the local press began publishing opinion pieces defending Barnes, the true extent of his influence became clear. The smear campaign. One article, published in the Fairhope Gazette, struck a nerve. The headline read, "Rogue Prosecutor Oversteps Boundaries. Targets Esteemed Judge." The piece painted Cameron as an opportunist with a political agenda, accusing him of using the investigation to elevate his own career. Cameron sat in his office, reading the article on his laptop, his fingers clenched into fists. Carla walked in, a steaming mug of coffee in her hand. She set it on his desk, her expression concerned. "You've seen it?" she asked softly. "Yeah," Cameron replied, his voice tight. "I expected them to come after me, but this is low, even for Barnes." Carla nodded. "It's not just the Gazette. Social media is buzzing with people defending him. They're calling him a pillar of the community." Cameron let out a bitter laugh. A pillar who's been exploiting that community for years. He stood and paced the room. "We need to stay focused. What's the status on the witness interviews?" Carla pulled out her notebook. We've got 10 new affidavits, including one from a retired police officer who worked court security. He says Barnes frequently made derogatory remarks about defendants when they weren't in the room. Cameron nodded, a spark of hope rekindling. That's good. The more first-hand accounts we have, the harder it will be for them to dismiss the evidence. A visit to the community. Despite the mounting pressure, Cameron made a point to attend another community meeting, this time held at the local library. The room was packed, with chairs lining every wall and people spilling into the hallway. Cameron stood at the front, feeling the weight of their collective hope. A young black woman approached the microphone. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but her words carried strength. My brother was arrested for a fight he didn't start. When we went to court, Judge Barnes barely let us speak. He fined us so much we had to sell my grandmother's car to pay it. We thought that's just how it was. But now I see. It wasn't right. The crowd murmured in agreement, and Cameron felt a deep sense of responsibility. He stepped forward to address them. I want you all to know that your voices matter, he said. This fight isn't just about one judge. It's about changing a system that has ignored fairness for too long. But we can't do it alone. Your stories, your courage, they're what make this possible. Keep speaking up, keep demanding justice. Applause filled the room, and for a moment, Cameron felt a flicker of optimism. The community's resolve was unshakable, and that gave him the strength to push forward. The first hearing. The day of the first formal hearing into Barnes' conduct arrived with a thick fog blanketing the courthouse. Cameron stood outside the chambers where the Judicial Review Commission would meet, clutching his briefcase tightly. Inside were hundreds of pages of evidence, carefully curated to present a clear and undeniable case against Barnes. As Cameron entered the room, he locked eyes with Barnes for the first time since the investigation began. The judge sat at a long table, flanked by his legal team. His expression was impassive, but his eyes burned with quiet fury. Cameron wasn't intimidated. He'd faced far more dangerous adversaries in federal courtrooms. The hearing began with the commission chair outlining the allegations against Barnes. Cameron listened intently as they detailed the evidence. Financial records showing suspicious payments from private probation companies, case logs revealing racial disparities in sentencing, and witness testimonies describing Barnes' biased comments and actions. When it was Cameron's turn to speak, he rose with confidence. Your Honors, this case is about more than one judge's behavior. It's about the integrity of our judicial system. Judge Barnes has violated the trust placed in him by the people of this community, and the evidence will show that his actions were not only unethical but deeply harmful. He presented his findings methodically, walking the commission through the statistical data, the witness accounts, and the financial anomalies. The room was silent, every eye fixed on Cameron as he made his case. Barnes' defense. When it was Barnes' attorney's turn to respond, they came out swinging. This is nothing more than a politically motivated attack, the lawyer declared. Judge Barnes has served this community honorably for over 20 years. These so-called disparities are cherry-picked data, taken out of context to fit a narrative. The defense attempted to discredit the witnesses, painting them as disgruntled defendants or biased observers. They also accused Cameron of using his position as a federal prosecutor to overreach into municipal matters. Cameron stayed calm, knowing the evidence spoke for itself. Still, the attack stung. He could see the subtle glances exchanged among the commissioners, the silent calculations they were making. This wouldn't be an easy battle. A key witness emerges. As the hearing stretched into its second day, the tide began to turn. One of the final witnesses was James Carter, the retired court security officer who had worked under Barnes for 15 years. His testimony was devastating. I saw it all, Carter said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. Judge Barnes treated black defendants differently. He'd make comments like, "They don't respect authority," or "They'll be back here in no time." I knew it wasn't right, but I felt powerless to say anything at the time. I'm here now because people like Cameron Price are finally shining a light on what's been happening. Carter's words hung heavy in the air. For the first time, Barnes looked visibly shaken. The commission members exchanged glances, their pens scratching furiously across their notepads. The weight of the moment. As the hearing adjourned for the day, Cameron stepped outside into the cool evening air. He stood on the courthouse steps, looking out over the town that had become both a battleground and a beacon of hope. People from the community gathered below, their faces filled with anticipation. "You're doing the right thing," a man said, stepping forward. It was the same elderly man who had spoken at the first town hall. He extended a hand, his grip firm. "We've been waiting for this for a long time." Cameron nodded, his resolve solidifying. He knew the road ahead was still uncertain, but he also knew he wasn't walking it alone. The truth was out, and the fight for justice was far from over. But as Cameron looked out at the crowd, he felt something he hadn't in weeks. Hope. The battle intensifies. The crisp morning air was unusually still as Cameron prepared for the second phase of the hearings. The weight of the past weeks bore down on him, but he had no time for hesitation. The stakes had grown exponentially. What began as a local investigation into Judge Barnes' conduct was now a symbol of the broader fight against systemic bias in the judiciary. A sudden challenge. As Cameron arrived at the courthouse, he was greeted by Julia Harper, his supervisor and ally in the fight. Her expression was tense, her usual confidence tinged with concern. "Cameron," she began, pulling him aside. "We've got a problem. Barnes' legal team just filed a motion to discredit the statistical evidence. They're claiming the data was manipulated and therefore inadmissible." Cameron frowned. "Manipulated? That's a stretch, even for them." "They're desperate," Julia replied. "But it means we'll have to defend the credibility of the data before we can proceed with the rest of the case. They're trying to bog us down in technicalities." Cameron exhaled sharply. "Fine. Let them. The data is solid, and we'll prove it." The data under fire. As the hearing resumed, Barnes' lead attorney took center stage, wielding the new motion like a weapon. "The so-called evidence presented by Mr. Price relies heavily on statistical analysis," the attorney argued. "However, this data has been cherry-picked to create a narrative of bias. It's incomplete, unreliable, and doesn't account for the complexities of judicial decision-making." Cameron rose to respond, his voice calm but resolute. "Your Honors, the data we've presented is not only reliable but corroborated by years of court records and first-hand accounts. This is not an isolated pattern. It's a systemic issue, and the numbers speak for themselves." He called Carla to the stand. As the primary researcher behind the statistical analysis, her expertise was critical. Under questioning, she explained how the data was collected, verified, and analyzed. "We didn't cherry-pick anything," Carla stated firmly. "We reviewed every case Judge Barnes presided over in the past 5 years. The disparities were consistent and undeniable." The commissioners listened intently, their expressions neutral but focused. Cameron knew this was a pivotal moment. If they accepted the validity of the data, it would bolster the case against Barnes. If not, it could unravel everything. The community rallies. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric. News of the hearing had spread far beyond Faro, drawing attention from state and national media. Protesters gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and "End judicial bias." Cameron stepped outside during a recess and was immediately surrounded by reporters. "Mr. Price, do you believe the data will hold up under scrutiny?" one journalist asked. "Yes," Cameron replied without hesitation. "The evidence is clear. Judge Barnes' actions are not just unethical. They're a betrayal of the trust placed in him by this community." Another reporter pushed forward. "How do you respond to allegations that you're pursuing this case for personal gain?" Cameron's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "This isn't about me. It's about ensuring that every person who walks into a courtroom is treated with dignity and fairness. If standing up for that principle makes me a target, so be it. His words were met with cheers from the crowd, and Cameron felt a surge of energy. The people were with him, and their support was a powerful motivator. A new ally. Later that afternoon, as Cameron reviewed his notes, he received an unexpected visitor. An older woman, impeccably dressed, introduced herself as Judge Margaret Connors, a retired appellate judge with a reputation for fairness and integrity. "I've been following your case closely," she said, her voice steady and warm. "What you're doing is brave, but you're going to need all the help you can get." Cameron raised an eyebrow. "What are you offering, Judge Connors?" "I know how the system works, Cameron. I've seen judges like Barnes before, men who think they're untouchable because of their connections. But those connections can be broken. If you're willing to listen, I can help you navigate this." Cameron didn't hesitate. "I'm all ears." Judge Connors outlined strategies for countering Barnes' defense and emphasized the importance of focusing on the human impact of his rulings. "Statistics are important," she said, "but stories are what move people. If you want to win this fight, you need to show the commissioners and the public how Barnes' actions have hurt real people." Humanizing the fight. Inspired by Judge Connors' advice, Cameron reached out to several community members who had shared their experiences with Barnes. He asked if they would be willing to testify at the next hearing. Many were hesitant, fearful of retaliation, but a few agreed. One of them was Anita Johnson, a single mother who had been fined exorbitantly for a minor traffic violation. "He didn't even look at me," Anita said during their meeting. "He just assumed I was guilty because of how I looked." Another was Robert Williams, a local teacher who had been penalized heavily for a zoning violation, while his white neighbor received only a warning for the same issue. "It wasn't just unfair," Robert said. "It was humiliating." Cameron prepared them carefully, ensuring they felt confident and supported. Their stories would put a human face on the abstract concepts of bias and inequality, making it impossible for the commissioners to ignore the real impact of Barnes' actions. The turning point. On the day of the next hearing, the courtroom was packed. Anita and Robert testified with courage and grace, their voices unwavering as they recounted their experiences. Cameron watched as the commissioners leaned forward, their expressions shifting from skepticism to concern. When the hearing adjourned, Cameron stepped outside to address the crowd. "Today, we heard the voices of people who have been silenced for too long," he said. "This fight isn't just about one judge. It's about creating a system that works for everyone." The crowd erupted in applause, and Cameron felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the fight was far from over, but for the first time, he could see the path to victory. Justice is delivered. The final day of the hearings dawned with an air of anticipation that seemed to saturate the courthouse. The room was filled to capacity. Media representatives, community members, and legal professionals gathered to witness the culmination of weeks of intense scrutiny and emotional testimony. Cameron arrived early, carrying the weight of not just his own determination, but the hopes of a community that had placed its trust in him. A final defense. Judge Barnes' defense team began the day by presenting their closing arguments. They doubled down on claims that the investigation was a politically motivated attack, orchestrated by a prosecutor looking to make a name for himself. "Your Honors," Barnes' lead attorney intoned, pacing in front of the commissioners, "this has been nothing more than a spectacle designed to tarnish the reputation of a man who has dedicated decades to public service. Judge Barnes' rulings reflect his commitment to upholding the law, not bias or impropriety." The defense attempted to sow doubt about the testimonies of witnesses, suggesting that their experiences were subjective and could not prove systemic misconduct. Barnes himself sat stoically, his expression unreadable, but Cameron could see the tension in his clenched jaw and the way his fingers gripped the armrests of his chair. When the defense rested, the room was quiet, the weight of the moment palpable. All eyes turned to Cameron as he rose for his rebuttal. Cameron's closing argument. Cameron approached the podium with a deliberate calm, his demeanor projecting confidence and conviction. He paused for a moment, letting the silence settle before he began. Your Honors, this case is not about one man's reputation. It's about the countless individuals whose lives have been impacted by decisions made in this courtroom. Decisions influenced not by fairness, but by bias. He gestured to the gallery, where Anita, Robert, and other community members who had testified sat. You've heard their stories. These are not isolated incidents. They are part of a pattern, one that is supported by data, corroborated by witnesses, and reflected in Judge Barnes' own words and actions. Cameron's voice grew stronger as he continued. Justice is not a privilege reserved for the few. It is a right guaranteed to all, regardless of race, status, or circumstance. When a judge, the very person entrusted to uphold this principle, fails to do so, the consequences ripple far beyond the courtroom. They undermine the public's faith in our legal system. He locked eyes with each commissioner as he delivered his final words. Today, you have the opportunity to send a message, not just to this community, but to all who look to our courts for fairness. You can affirm that no one, not even a judge, is above accountability. Cameron stepped back, the room holding its collective breath before erupting into murmurs. He returned to his seat, meeting Julia's approving nod and Carla's quiet smile. The decision. After a tense recess, the commissioners returned to deliver their verdict. The chairwoman's expression was grave as she addressed the room. After thorough deliberation, this commission finds that Judge Harold Barnes engaged in conduct unbecoming of his office, including systemic bias and financial impropriety. Effective immediately, Judge Barnes is removed from his position, and his actions will be referred to the appropriate authorities for further investigation. A collective gasp filled the room, followed by scattered applause. Cameron exhaled, the weight of weeks of effort finally lifting. He glanced at Barnes, whose face had gone pale. For a moment, their eyes met. Barnes' gaze was a mixture of defiance and disbelief, but Cameron felt no triumph. Only the solemn satisfaction of knowing justice had been served. The aftermath. The impact of the decision was immediate and far-reaching. Local news outlets ran headlines such as, "Disgraced Judge Removed. A community's fight for justice prevails," while national media picked up the story as a broader example of systemic bias being confronted. Cameron became a reluctant public figure, his name synonymous with accountability and reform. Invitations to speak at legal conferences and community events poured in, but he remained focused on his work. His goal had never been fame. It had always been justice, healing the community. In the weeks following the hearing, Cameron returned to the community meetings that had become a cornerstone of his fight. This time, the atmosphere was different, less heavy with frustration, more energized by hope. At one meeting, Anita approached him with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "Because of you, people like me feel like we matter." Cameron smiled. "You always mattered, Anita." This fight was about making sure everyone sees that. The community began organizing their own initiatives, pushing for reforms in the local judiciary, and creating support networks for those navigating the legal system. Cameron watched with pride as the people he had fought for took up the mantle of change. A personal reflection. Late one evening, Cameron sat alone in his home office, reflecting on the journey. The framed photo of his mother's house, the catalyst for this entire ordeal, caught his eye. He realized that his fight against Barnes had been about more than one judge or one courtroom. It had been about protecting the values his mother had instilled in him, the belief that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. As he closed his laptop, his phone buzzed with a message from Julia. "The DOJ wants us to look into similar cases in other jurisdictions. Are you in?" Cameron replied without hesitation. "Always." A legacy of change. Cameron's case against Judge Barnes became a symbol of what was possible when courage met persistence. It inspired others across the country to challenge injustice in their own communities. And though the fight for fairness was far from over, Cameron knew that together they were building a system that better reflected the ideals they all deserved to see. Justice, after all, wasn't just a principle, it was a promise. and Cameron Price had proven that it was a promise worth fighting for. Justice is served. The weight of the commission's ruling lingered in the air long after the hearing adjourned. As Judge Barnes was escorted out of the courtroom, his shoulders slumped under the collective judgment of the community and the law. For Cameron, the victory felt profound but bittersweet. Justice had been served, but it was clear the fight against systemic bias would continue far beyond Barnes' removal. Community redemption. The days following the ruling were transformative for Faro. The community, galvanized by the outcome, came together to address deeper issues in their local justice system. Cameron was approached by civic leaders and activists seeking advice on how to maintain the momentum. At one town hall, Anita Johnson stood before a packed room, her voice steady and clear. "This isn't the end. It's the beginning. Judge Barnes may be gone, but we have to make sure no one else abuses their power like that again." Her words struck a chord, and the crowd erupted into applause. Cameron, seated in the back, felt a swell of pride. The people he had fought for were now fighting for themselves. They began organizing workshops on understanding legal rights, forming watchdog groups to monitor local court proceedings, and advocating for state-level judicial reforms. Personal vindication. One quiet evening, Cameron visited his mother's house, the home that had been the catalyst for everything. He stood on the porch, looking out at the neighborhood he had grown up in. The house felt different now, not just a place of memories, but a reminder of resilience and purpose. He sat on the steps, thinking about how a simple property tax issue had spiraled into a battle that exposed the inequities plaguing their community. His phone buzzed. It was a message from Carla. Breaking. State launches audit of other municipal judges in Alabama. Your case started something big. Cameron smiled. The ripple effect of the case was already spreading, but he also knew the journey wasn't over. Every victory brought new challenges, and he was ready for them. An unexpected encounter. A week later, Cameron received a letter in the mail. The handwriting on the envelope was neat and precise. Inside was a brief note. "Mr. Price, I've had time to reflect on my actions and the impact they've had. While I may never agree with how the case against me was handled, I cannot deny the truths that came to light. I hope the changes in our community will bring fairness to those I have wronged. Sincerely, Harold Barnes." Cameron read the letter twice, unsure how to feel. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was an acknowledgement, a crack in the armor of a man who had once seemed impenetrable. A new chapter. Months later, Cameron stood at a podium at a statewide legal conference. He had been invited to deliver the keynote address on judicial accountability and systemic reform. The room was filled with judges, attorneys, and activists, all eager to hear his perspective. "Accountability isn't just about punishment," Cameron began. "It's about creating a system that reflects the values we claim to uphold: fairness, equality, and justice for all." The case against Judge Barnes was never about vengeance. It was about ensuring that no one is above the principles that bind us as a society. His words resonated, drawing a standing ovation. As he stepped off the stage, Judge Margaret Connors approached him, a look of approval on her face. "Well done," she said. "You've shown that change is possible, even in a system as entrenched as ours." Closing the circle. Cameron's work continued, but he never forgot the community that had stood by him. He frequently returned to Fairhope, not as a prosecutor, but as a neighbor and advocate. The town began to transform, its justice system becoming a model for other municipalities. One sunny afternoon, as Cameron walked through the courthouse square, he was approached by a young boy holding his mother's hand. "Are you Mr. Price?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. "I am," Cameron replied, crouching to the boy's level. "My mom says you're the reason things are fair now." Cameron smiled, his heart full. "It wasn't just me. A lot of people made it happen." The boy grinned. "I want to be like you when I grow up." As the boy and his mother walked away, Cameron stood in the square, taking in the scene around him. A town beginning to heal, a community reclaiming its voice. For the first time in months, he felt a profound sense of peace, a legacy of change. Cameron's fight against Judge Barnes became more than a legal case. It became a blueprint for change. His actions inspired others across the state and beyond to confront systemic injustices in their own communities. While the battle for equity was far from over, Cameron knew they had taken an important step forward. And as he looked ahead, he realized the fight for justice wasn't just a job or a duty. It was his life's purpose. And it was a fight he would never stop pursuing.